In 2011, 15 coffins were uncovered when digging for a residential swimming pool on this block. The occupants of these coffins turned out to be Native Americans and Africans. If you look at an early map of the French-settled New Orleans, this entire block was St. Peter's, the first cemetery in the city.
They didn't get everybody. There's still human remains down there to this day.
There are still lots of bodies possibly underneath St. Peter's, but it's a bar that sits on top now, which is called the Voodoo Lounge.
Paranormal tours about ghosts and vampires now begin at the Voodoo Lounge. I love ghost tours as much as anyone, but I wanted to learn more about the history that often gets buried under the excitement of the supernatural. So I took a trip. The goal is to understand how and why New Orleans became this. I went to learn from locals and experts, but what I experienced when I landed was the single most influential factor on the city: the water. I showed up in a massive downpour, and it gave me good insight into the challenges the city faces.
It just doesn't, you can't even grasp how hard it's raining.
But when the rain stopped, I got to experience New Orleans.
Every step you take here, you're walking on history. I mean, unknown history.
New Orleans sits right near the southern coast of the United States. It's sandwiched between the Mississippi River and Lake Pontchartrain. I set out to understand this map, but I quickly got sucked into the oldest part of the city, which is this grid right here, known today as the French Quarter.
So from Canal, Decatur, Esplanade, and Rampart is just the French Quarter, which is the original city of New Orleans called La Nouvelle Orléans.
This is Yaya Universe, and she's a local guide and one of my new friends that's going to help me tell this story.
I do talk too much. I'm a tour guide.
This is crucial to understand, so I actually had to get a second map so that we could get a closer look just at the French Quarter. Just short of being a mile by half a mile, this grid was laid out in 1721 by the French and was essentially the entire city for almost the first 100 years. You'll sometimes also hear it referred to as the Vieux Carré. A large reason it didn't expand for so long was because of the river it lies along. The Mississippi builds up land along its banks, creating a natural levee, where the land closest to the river is highest. You've probably heard that New Orleans is below sea level, and that's true for most of the modern city. But it's not true of the original settlement. It was actually placed here because it's above sea level.
Between the river and going about 2 miles back, we call it the natural levee because that's high ground, that's above sea level.
Lawrence wrote this book called An Accidental City. He's a Civil War Reconstruction historian and just all around awesome guy. So right here on the bank of the river is the highest land, and that land slowly descends until right here. This is Claiborne Avenue and is where the land descends back to sea level. You can see on this 1817 map that this used to be the shoreline of the cypress swamp that once surrounded New Orleans. Being built on this higher ground is why the French Quarter didn't flood during Hurricane Katrina in 2005. In fact, in these satellite photos that show the flooding during the hurricane, you can see where the city gets its nickname, the Crescent City. But why put a city right here? I came here for the map and the history, but I happened to be here while Mardi Gras is getting started, and one part of Mardi Gras that I didn't know about was that they have a dog parade. New Orleans knows how to party, I'll tell you that. New Orleans is a funny spot for a city because in some regards, it's the worst place you could put one.
Hurricanes, pestilence, flooding, subsidence, mosquitoes, all the rest.
And in other ways, it's the most obvious place that a city was kind of destined to be.
This is the only place within 100 nautical miles of the mouth where you could build a city. So in effect, for commercial purposes, this is where the river meets the sea.
The Mississippi River really is the mother of New Orleans. Through this single point drains roughly 40% of all the water in the continental United States. For thousands of years, the Native Americans used it for transportation and trade, and when the French colonists arrived, they saw its value.
They saw it as a strategic asset, something to keep the British away from too far penetrating into the North American mainland.
Knowing that the river is the entire reason there's a city here in the first place makes the orientation of the streets in the French Quarter make a lot more sense. I talked to Winston Ho from the Historic New Orleans Collection, which is an awesome free museum in the French Quarter, which you should absolutely go see if you're watching this video. There's tons of maps in there. You're going to love it, I promise. Winston speaks more clearly and more concisely than I do when I sit down and write a script. So when he talks, I'm going to do my best to just not interrupt him. The grid runs parallel to the sharpest point in this bend on the Mississippi River. So it actually lies 37 degrees off from north.
This is why compass directions are meaningless around here. Wherever you are in New Orleans, you have to kind of know where the river is and kind of know where the lake is. The river and the lake define the whole geography of the region.
This has an odd side effect because for most of its course, the Mississippi runs north-south, giving it an east bank and a west bank. The terms East Bank and West Bank remain in New Orleans, even though the river has turned and the city sits on yet another sharp turn.
If you're standing over here at the end of Canal Street, you're looking across the river at the west bank of the river, but the west bank is actually to the east of you.
That is very confusing to me, personally. Okay, but why did they choose a gridded layout on this bank of the Mississippi?
It's a very typical French colonial plan. So if you look at the early maps of like New Orleans, Pensacola, Mobile, St. Louis, they all resemble each other. They all have a town square, which they often called the Place d'Armes.
This is Peter Dandridge, who you'll hear more from later. Today, this square is called Jackson Square after Andrew Jackson, who led a victory in the Battle of New Orleans and later became a U.S. president.
This square is now called Jackson Square, but its original name was Place d'Armes, or Plaza de Armas under the Spanish. And this was actually a rallying ground for the militia. So the militia was, if the city ever came under attack, the militia would show up here. This was also a parade ground where the militia would practice their drills. So today it's a nice planned French garden, but originally it was a muddy field.
These early maps of New Orleans show a city wall surrounding it. It looks quite impressive, but in reality it wasn't much.
These walls, I think, were much more impressive on paper than they would have been in real life. I don't think these walls would have stopped anyone.
But Yaya mentioned that Rampart Street was the name for the street at the back of the French Quarter, and this is the reason for that. The name for Barracks Street is also another remnant of this. Okay, while we're talking about this old city wall, I actually want to go on a quick tangent. I learned a new word recently.
Oh, what a terrible sound.
This isn't the word, but please subscribe. You know when someone erases a chalkboard, writes over it, and you can still see what was written beneath? This is palimpsest. In my last video, I spent a day walking around Salt Lake City with Steven Olson, who is super awesome. If you haven't seen that video, I'll link it up there and you can check it out. But he taught me this word, palimpsest. The idea of palimpsest is that you can read something under what is currently written. It's kind of like if you can read the business that used to be in a building where the sign was taken down months ago. That's palimpsest. Steven pointed out that this is what I'm doing on this channel, and he's exactly right. I love looking at old maps because you can look at what's currently there and see what used to be there. These old maps have so much information about the history of a place and the values of the people that lived there. And there's an example of this in New Orleans with this old city wall. On this old map of the French Quarter, you can see the wall that once surrounded the city. Even though the wall is long gone, you can still see in this satellite image these property lines that show where it was. Another example of this is the street that breaks the grid right here. It's called Bayou Road.
You'll notice that there's a waterway over here that extends from Lake Pontchartrain towards the river, and this is Bayou St. John. And from Bayou St. John, there's this natural ridge that's also above sea level that leads right to where the French Market is today.
The French Market is an open-air market that you can still go to. The oldest structure in the market is from 1813, but this place has been a place of gathering long before the French got here.
And this is the site of Bubancha, which means place of many languages in the Choctaw language. And it actually was a Native American seasonal market, and indigenous people would converge on Bubancha every spring to trade. So it was the French-Canadian explorer Bienville who followed this waterway and went down this ancient Native American portage to this location that was well above sea level. His local scouts told him that this is also the shortest distance from the river to the lake. And Bienville said, this is a really good place to build a city. So that's the historic reason why New Orleans is where it is.
Whenever I come on these trips, I always am trying to figure out how much gear I should or shouldn't bring, and I inevitably bring way too much, except for this time. I think I packed right, and I didn't have to bring my drone because of today's sponsor, Storyblocks. Whether you pay monthly or annually, you can get access to their entire library of diverse, high-quality 4K footage, or their audio library or their After Effects templates. For example, all the drone footage you've been seeing in this video is from Storyblocks. They even have a plugin for Premiere, which is the editing software I use, so I don't have to leave Premiere at all. I can just click over to Storyblocks, find the footage that I want, download it without ever leaving the software at all. If you're interested in getting your own access to high quality footage, go to storyblocks.com/Daniel Steiner or hit the link at the top of the description. Thank you to Storyblocks for sponsoring this video, and let's get back to the map of New Orleans. Obviously, there's more to New Orleans than just the French Quarter, but for the first 100 years, this basically was the entire city. In fact, at the very beginning, the city was actually 2 blocks shorter, and a moat ran down what is now Dauphine Street. That means that the cemetery I talked about at the beginning of the video, St. Peter's, was outside of the original city. But when 2 more blocks were added, this cemetery ended up in its walls.
And by Spanish colonial rule, they decided that this is probably not a good idea to have a cemetery where all these people are going to be living. So they decided to move the whole cemetery farther back. And that became St. Louis Cemetery number 1. And St. Louis number 1 is still there to this day.
The cemeteries in New Orleans are tourist attractions in and of themselves because they're above ground and they're really beautiful. I took a tour of one while I was there, and I wasn't allowed to film it, but the tour guide told me that the reason these tombs are above ground is because of the low water table. But when I talked to Winston and Lawrence, this is what they had to say about it.
It's a myth that they're above ground because of the high water table. They're that way more for reasons of status, because you could show off your status. You had more money, so you could build these fancy tombs.
Purely cultural, because that's the way the French bury people, also the way the Spanish and Italians bury people. St. Louis Cemetery number 1, most of it is Catholic, but there's a Protestant section in the back. Almost everyone in the Protestant section is buried underground.
Winston mentions both the French and the Spanish, and in order to understand the character of the city, it's important to know that it traded hands. It was settled by the French, then traded to the Spanish, and then for a brief moment back to the French before Napoleon sold it in 1803 as part of the Louisiana Purchase.
So it was a strategic, not a financial asset. So it was dispensable.
But all 3 of those countries brought Africans into the city under slavery. And this had a huge impact on the culture and demographic of the city that is still evident to today.
They used both the brawn and the brains of African Americans to build the city.
But it's complicated because, as you can see in this portrait over here, New Orleans also had a very large free people of color population.
They were able to, quote unquote, buy back their freedom, which means they were able to represent themselves in the 1700s underneath the Code Noir, which happened in 1724. So you actually had black people in the 1700s representing themselves freely here in New Orleans, and this is the first place they have done it.
It was the most prosperous, sophisticated, and politically self-confident black community anywhere in the country.
And these free people of color, they were extraordinarily affluent. They were far better educated than the average white Southerner. They were French-speaking, Catholic, and many of them were planters and slave owners themselves. So that whole history of African Americans here in this city is actually very complicated.
Creole means of the colony. So when you have all the French people coming over, once they start integrating with the people here, the people that are born here from French, from the natives, from anybody who intertwined here and mingled, that is what Creole is. Creole just means of the colony.
While New Orleans was under Spanish rule, there were two big fires in the French Quarter, and they were only 6 years apart from each other. These have had a lasting impact on the character of the French Quarter. Peter, who you met earlier, works as a curatorial associate at the historic Gallier House, a well-preserved house from the mid-1800s right here. He gave me a tour of the house while I was there, and if you ever find yourself in New Orleans, I highly recommend you do the same.
So the French Quarter actually has very little French architecture because of those two fires. Most of the French colonial architecture disappeared with those fires. So most of our early architecture is actually more Spanish, the biggest exception being the Ursuline Convent because it was a freestanding structure in the middle of several blocks worth of gardens, and so it survived.
Okay, I've been talking about the French Quarter for a while, so let's switch to this other map that I said we'd get to. I want to start by pointing out this major roadway right here, which borders the French Quarter. This is Canal Street. Right now I'm standing between two streetcar tracks, which is kind of surprising to me that we're allowed to just walk across these tracks. But you have these two tracks, and then you have 3 lanes of traffic on either side, and this is Canal Street. It's surprisingly wide for a street that's called a street instead of like a boulevard or an avenue, and it's sort of the main identifying street of New Orleans.
Canal Street used to be called the Great Wide Way.
What makes this street significant beyond just its massive width is that it's the dividing line between two different neighborhoods. After the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, the city began to see rapid expansion. And one of the first suburbs of New Orleans was this area, known as Faubourg Sainte-Marie, which also became known as the American Sector and is today known as the Central Business District, or CBD.
And in fact, historically, New Orleans was almost like two different cities glued together at the center. On one side of Canal Street, you have the French Quarter, which was the French-speaking Catholic part of the city. But the other side of the French Quarter was the American Sector, and this was the English-speaking Protestant part of the city. That's also why all the street names changed from one side of Canal Street to the other.
So you got the Americans on one side of the Canal Street, and then you have the French on the other side. Now remember, the French were very integrated with the black people. Canal Street was the shopping center and the shopping district for white people. So yes, Canal Street was a divider. If you were black, you're not about to cross Canal Street back in the day. We can do it now though.
In New Orleans, all of the medians in the road are referred to as neutral ground, and that term has its origin in Canal Street. Because Canal Street was so wide and it was the dividing line between these two neighborhoods, it was sort of a neutral space that was used by both. Contrary to what the name implies, it was actually never a canal. This green area here is now a park called the Liffey Greenway, and it was built over top the path of a canal.
And that canal is actually still there to this day. It's inside the Liffey Greenway, and it's a glorified drainage ditch. But originally it was a navigational canal, and the original idea is that there was supposed to be a second canal that connected from the turning basin to the river. And this canal was never built. But that's why the Canal Street is so wide, and also why the name stuck.
This street, which is such a centerpiece for the city, now sits in contrast to a road on the other side of the French Quarter, Elysian Fields. This road runs in a straight line from the Mississippi River all the way to Lake Pontchartrain. Drawing these lines straight is not easy for me. And unlike Canal Street, this actually was formerly a canal built in the 1740s. The owner of a plantation and mill right here was using the water coming down the Mississippi to power his mill. And so he created a canal running back this way that would use that water. He made it perfectly straight so that the water wouldn't lose any power in turns and bends. And then over the years, it got filled in and was actually replaced with a train car that would run back and forth. So for decades, if you were visiting New Orleans, you probably would have come from Lake Pontchartrain to the lighthouse right here, and then taken the railway down this street to the French Quarter. This former railway was the shortest point between the Mississippi and Lake Pontchartrain, and it set the orientation of the grid for a large portion of the city. The interesting thing about this road is that the name is the English version of the Champs-Élysées, which in Paris is the main major boulevard. The street is still wide and lined with trees with a big neutral ground in the middle, but it does not have the allure that Canal Street does. The last name of the plantation owner whose slaves built the canal that was here in the 1740s, his last name was Marigny, and that's where this neighborhood gets its name. Faubourg Marigny was also one of the very early neighborhoods in New Orleans. And if you visit, you'll hear the term Faubourg a lot, which is the French term for basically suburb.
This side of Esplanade, that's the French Quarter. We cross on this side right here, you're now in the Marigny. And that's just like crossing Esplanade on the other side. If you're on this side of it, you're in the French Quarter. Once you cross the other side of Esplanade, you are now in the Treme, the oldest African-American neighborhood in the entire United States.
Another early, very important neighborhood is Treme, right here. In the 1960s, Louis Armstrong Park was built right here in a controversial renewal project that demolished several city blocks in the Treme neighborhood to make way for this park. Okay, on a bit of a larger scale, let's just look at the general layout of the streets in New Orleans.
If you look at a modern day map of New Orleans, you see all these wedges that start at the river, they're wider at the river, and then as they go toward the lake, they kind of go into their little point, the top of a triangle, if you will.
This 1834 map shows where this pattern comes from.
If you look at these plantations, you'll see their boundary lines are now major streets, major avenues.
They were just being subdivided as the city started expanding.
So remember how Claiborne, which I'll redraw on this map right here, was the banks of the cypress swamps?
Your plantation would have started at the river and it would have ended in the swamps.
In the mid-1800s, much of the water in those swamps was drained to make way for further expansion of the city.
They talk about New Orleans being a bowl, and well, that bowl is a drained cypress swamp.
So almost all of this area here is post-1850 development. I obviously can't fit everything in here, but one more important thing that happened is that Robert Moses came to town. Robert Moses is like Santa Claus. If Santa Claus didn't dress cool, didn't bring cheer, didn't bring presents, wasn't associated with Christmas, and built expressways through impoverished or marginalized neighborhoods. If you spend any amount of time studying urban design in the United States, you're going to hear the name Robert Moses. He was an incredibly powerful and influential urban planner that made a lot of controversial decisions.
Robert Moses thought it would be a good idea to build a highway between the Mississippi River and the French Quarter, because this is Robert Moses we're talking about. He did this everywhere he went. And this Vieux-Carré Expressway proposal divided the entire city. Most of the political leadership and people who supported economic development wanted the highway built, but preservationists in the Catholic Church opposed it. And ultimately, the preservationists won. So Interstate 10 was not built over here. Instead, Interstate 10 was built over here, over the North Claiborne Avenue corridor, destroying all the black-owned businesses that used to be lined up there and cutting the historically black Treme neighborhood in half.
The city still battles a lot of the issues it has from the very beginning, but it's shown tremendous resilience. And I hope this gives you a better understanding of the map of New Orleans. Thank you so much to the locals and experts who made this video immeasurably better. Couldn't have made it without you. Go give them a shout out in the comments. Tell them how awesome they are. I'm going to leave a bunch of links in the description so you can read more if you're interested. Thanks for watching this. Please subscribe to the channel. Like this video. If you made it this far, please give it that like. And I'll see you in another one super soon. Peace.
I'm from New Orleans. I mean, when you're a New Orleans native, New Orleans is the only place in the world that's normal. Everywhere else is weird. It's like, you watch like the Thanksgiving Day parade, and it's like, you mean we're supposed to just stand here and watch the floats go by? They're not going to throw things at us like toys or stuffed animals or candy or something? It's weird.